On October 13, 1972, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 left Uruguay for Chile to play a rugby game against their national team. The plane had 45 people on board, 33 of them players from the national team, the rest family and friends. The team had requested the flight be canceled because of bad weather, but they were told it would be fine. They took off. The plane climbed steadily through the clouds, which meant that nobody noticed when the pilot deviated from the planned route. The clouds parted, and the plane emerged above the Andes Mountains at an altitude of around 14,000 feet. But the pilot realized that they were much higher than they should have been, and far off course. He knew he didn't have enough fuel to make it back to Uruguay, so he turned the plane around and tried to head back. But the wind caught them and pushed them further off course. The fuel warning light went on, and the pilot put out a distress call. Then everything went black. Flight 571 had crashed into the side of a mountain. It was 8:15 in the morning. The impact killed 9 people instantly. Roberto Canessa was not one of them. When he came to, he was surrounded by the wreckage of the plane and the bodies of his friends and teammates. Of the 45 people on board, only 16 had survived. The crash had happened so high up in the mountains that they were met with temperatures of 30 degrees Celsius below zero. To make matters worse, it was snowing, and soon a thick layer of snow covered the wreckage. The survivors huddled together trying to keep warm, drinking melted snow and eating what was left of the plane's chocolate cake. As the night wore on, 3 more people died of hypothermia, bringing the total number of deaths to 12. A few days passed, and the survivors started to lose hope. There was no sign of help, and the constant pain of hunger and cold was taking its toll on them. Then Roberto Canessa remembered something. There was a small village near the peak of the mountain where the plane had crashed. It was called El Plomo, and it was 5 kilometers away. It would be a dangerous trek, but if they could make it, then they could get help. Roberto convinced 3 other survivors to go with him. They were a mix of young men and women. One was a doctor, another 2 were teenagers, but none of them had ever gone hiking in the mountains, let alone in such terrible conditions. On December 9th, just over 2 weeks since the crash, they set off. They had no proper gear or supplies. They dressed in whatever clothes they could find among the wreckage, and when they found some abandoned backpacks from the dead, they filled them with stones to use as weights. That way they could ration out the food and water they had found in the wreckage. From the beginning, it was clear this was going to be a very difficult journey. The weather was bitter cold, and the terrain was rough. Within hours, everyone was exhausted and demoralized. They slept in a cave to protect themselves from the elements and woke up shivering and weak. By the time the sun set, they were all freezing and hungry. They ate some snow and drank some water from a stream, then huddled together for warmth and tried to sleep. During the day, Roberto struggled to keep everyone's spirits up. But that night he lost hope. He thought they would all die here. In the morning, however, he woke up feeling strangely refreshed. Maybe it was the altitude or the thin air, but he felt as if a new lease of life had been given to him. Deciding to take advantage of the moment, he forced himself and the others to carry on. That day they walked for 7 hours, and by nightfall, they had covered 2,400 meters. They decided to spend the night in a cave, and in the morning, they carried on again. 3 hours later, they reached the next shelter. They stayed there for 2 nights while they waited for the weather to improve. It was there that one of the survivors, a 19-year-old girl named Cecilia, died. They buried her in the snow and carried on. By now, Roberto was exhausted. His legs were bleeding and blistered. The backpack weighed heavily on his shoulders. His breathing was labored. But he pushed on, and the other survivors followed his lead. Now that they were so close to the village, they couldn't afford to give up. On the 5th day, they emerged from the mountain pass. Before them lay a valley dotted with houses. It was the village of El Plomo. The survivors stumbled out of the mountains like zombies. When the villagers saw them, they rushed forward and enveloped them in blankets. Soon they were inside a house being fed hot soup and drinks. People stared at them in disbelief. They couldn't believe that these emaciated, half-frozen figures were actually alive. The survivors were taken to a hospital where they learned the sad news. The other 29 passengers and crew members had not survived. News of the survivors spread quickly, and so did the criticism of the Uruguayan Air Force. Many people thought the pilots had deliberately flown the plane into the mountains in order to save fuel. A judicial investigation was launched, but it eventually concluded that the crash had been an accident caused by pilot error. The survivors returned home as heroes. They had conquered death itself, and their story made headlines around the world. But not all of them were so lucky. After a year of physical and psychological therapy, 4 of the survivors took their own lives. And years later, several others admitted that they still suffered from nightmares and flashbacks. There was one survivor in particular who drew special attention. It was Roberto Canessa. The newspapers dubbed him the Superman of the Andes. His story was especially remarkable because he had been in charge of the group and had made the decision to leave the crash site. Some people criticized him for putting the others at risk, but others admired his courage and determination. When he grew older, he became an athlete, competing in triathlons, marathons, and mountain races. He also wrote a book about his experience, which was later adapted into a movie. He spent the rest of his life traveling the world, giving talks to schools and youth groups about the importance of believing in yourself and never giving up hope. But not everyone was happy with the attention. One of the survivors, a woman named Liliana, never married and died believing that she had post-traumatic stress disorder. She didn't want anyone to know that she had been one of the survivors of Flight 571. She hid her face during TV interviews and never spoke about her experience in public. She died believing that she was cursed. She had been engaged to a man named Eduardo, but he died in the plane crash. Years later, she met someone else and fell in love. But he, too, died unexpectedly in a car accident. She refused to believe that it was just a coincidence. In fact, 8 of the 16 survivors either died or attempted suicide. You would think that surviving a plane crash in the middle of the unforgiving Andes would be enough to bring a person to the brink of death. But clearly, surviving the crash was just the beginning of their problems. Not everyone is so lucky. Another survivor, a man named Javier, was offered a place at the 1976 Summer Olympics, but he turned it down. He didn't want to be reminded of what had happened to his friends. Like many of the other survivors, he was haunted by the memory of those who had died. He couldn't understand why he had been spared while so many of his friends had died. He became an alcoholic and died aged 42. Some survivors believed that they were chosen by God to live, while others believed that they had been abandoned by God. They fought in court for years over who was right. It wasn't until 1980 that the truth finally came out. A judge ruled that there had been no negligence on the part of the pilots, and that the crash had been an accident. The families of the dead were awarded compensation, but no amount of money could bring back the dead. In 2011, the last surviving pilot of Flight 571 died. Roque died of cancer at the age of 84. His death marked the end of an era. Now all the pilots and crew members who had been involved in the tragedy were dead. Every year on October 13th, the people of Uruguay remember the 29 people who died on Flight 571. They hold a minute's silence at 8:15 a.m., the time that the plane crashed. And they pray that the souls of the dead find peace in the mountains of the Andes. Maybe it would have been better if they hadn't survived. At least then they wouldn't have had to live with the memories of what happened that day. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.